Welcome everybody to another Starin AV Meetup Coffee Break. I would like to congratulate Raymond Falsick, and I really hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Raymond, and Alan Lindsay, who both chimed in at exactly the same moment with the correct answer of the time signature for the Dave Brubeck song Take 5. It's 5-4 is the answer. It's presented as a fraction, with the top number being the amount of notes in a measure and the bottom number being the type of notes in a measure. So in this case, 5 quarter notes per measure. Who parked the car? Phil did. Who parked the car? I think those are the lyrics, anyway. So, again, congratulations both to Raymond and to Alan. Our Term AV Meetup, it comes from our local in-person events where we've taken folks from San Francisco to Boston or Chicago or Philadelphia and some other markets out on boat trips. We've shown some working systems in the process, and it's an awful lot of fun. AV Meetup on the web has 2 versions. There's the coffee break, when under the time it takes to sip on a cup of Java. We cover application-driven topics, and then the second version is the workshop, and that goes deep into the subject over the course of an hour. So today is a workshop. Now, note during the presentation, we've muted everybody just in the interest of keeping the noise floor down, so for questions, I ask that you use the questions pane, which many of you have found, to put in your answer. Stay with us to get your super cool AV over IP t-shirt. Yes, you're part of the beginning of our series on network solutions, and your responsibility is to show the world that you know AV over IP with your cool t-shirt. Make sure we have your size if you haven't given it to us in the registration process. I want to ask you guys a question because the response to Professor Phil's workshop has been so incredible. I want to ask you this. Would you be interested in having an in-depth 2 to 3 day advanced live training session on AV over IP? You'd attend a meeting location to learn these network principles with practical applications, including setting routers, getting streaming encoders, video conferencing, collaboration sharing, and working on the network. Now, it would cost you about $300 or so per attendee per day, and you'd have Professor Phil in person as your instructor. Now, we here at Starin, we'd be appealing to your management to make you a company with AV over IP trained professionals. So these sessions would be held in locations across the country this summer. And if you think you'd like this and your company or you would fund the training, please write yes in the chat box. And, man, people are already doing that. That's awesome. So, again, the response has been great. So write yes in the chat box, and then we'll start scheduling and obviously letting you know when and where. Thank you again for your responses. So I want to introduce our presenter today, Phil Hippensteel. He's a professor, researcher, writer, and consultant that's worked in both the AV and the IT industries. As a teacher, he spent over 40 years in higher education and finished his full-time career at Penn State, where he currently teaches part-time. This is the part that amazes me. Over 3 decades, he has taught nearly 12,000 students across 27 states. He's an active researcher working on IP video transport and network performance. For 4 years, he wrote a column called Ask Professor Phil for AV Technology Magazine. And his column has just been modified to be a tutorial series called Professor Phil's Bite-Sized Lessons. He has also written dozens of feature articles for AV Technology, Information Week, and Network World magazines. Clearly, you're with a man who knows his stuff. So without any further delay, Professor Phil, take it away.
Thanks, Neil. Our topic today is security basics for AV. And I have a preliminary statement to make before we get really started into it. Before we dig into the material, I want to set the stage for today's topic. IT security concepts are based on an underlying theory that's very complex and full of mathematics. So we'll be staying at a relatively high level. However, hopefully you'll gain a sense of some of the techniques that are secure and others that are very, very secure. And it may help you understand why a manufacturer recommends one of these procedures or one of these protocols over another. So with that preliminary statement in mind, today we're going to cover several goals of any security system. We're going to talk about encryption keys. The vast majority of people have their idea of encryption keys from TV shows or from stories about World War II's efforts by the Allies to break the German encryption codes. Little of that has anything to do with modern encryption. Then we'll discuss authentication, which is validating a source, a user, a device, or a process. And finally, we'll talk about some suggestions for good and bad security practices. So our security goals. The first security goal is privacy. We want to make sure that when we send a message, only the recipient that's intended is supposed to be able to read the message. Modern encryption techniques are extremely secure and can generally only be defeated in one of two ways. Either somebody steals the password or the key, or somebody guesses it by brute force. But guessing by brute force, which was clearly illustrated in the recent movie called Imitation Game, where they used a whole lot of women attempting the combinations, kind of working as secretaries, and some machines, which by the way in the movie weren't named, but they were called bombs. Those crude machines tried every conceivable combination until they finally came up with the one that would break the current German code. The process that we use in encryption today would require millions, billions, trillions, maybe even trillions of attempts with the fastest computers we have on Earth in order to find the correct combination. There are just a couple of exceptions, one which isn't in Wi-Fi, and I'll mention that as we proceed along. Integrity: was the message modified while it was in transmission, or was it corrupted by some kind of noise or something like that? This is a relatively easy thing to check, and we actually do that every time we send an Ethernet message, which I'll mention a little bit later on. Authenticity is the sender is actually who they represent themselves to be. That is to say, if Bill is sending a message to Mary, is Bill's message really coming from Bill, or is it coming from someone that's pretending to be Bill? Finally, accountability is tracking what an authenticated user is able to access. This is a little beyond the scope of what we're able to do today. For any of you who work in a Microsoft environment, Microsoft has a very sophisticated accounting process to keep track of what account accesses what files and what applications. But that's something that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we do today, and quite frankly is something we're not particularly interested in, at least at this point, in using security in the AV industry. So let's turn our attention to encryption. Till about the 1960s, encryption used complicated forms of character replacement. In other words, A might be replaced with T, and T replaced with $, B replaced with Z, and so forth. That's what the German Enigma machine did in World War II. It did three such successive replacements, and by the end of the war they were doing 4 successive replacements. The idea was that if you replace the characters often enough, the characters will be so scrambled that it's almost impossible for someone to figure out how they were scrambled. But that process was reversible, and in fact that's what the movie was about. Today, our algorithms are based on procedures which are irreversible. And there are a lot of math functions that are used to do that. Some of the common ones that you might have heard about include the sine function from trigonometry, the mod function from high school, possibly studied in high school math, and some other functions. The idea is that if you're using a key and an algorithm and it's encrypting it correctly and someone sees that you're transmitting the character 21, it's absolutely impossible to find out what was it that was used to create that 21. I've occasionally had some bold students who tell me they're going to break something like the digital encryption standard, which is a very common standard. It's used in finance. Then they'll try to understand the mathematics within the algorithm, and they'll simply give up. Make no mistake, encryption involves very advanced mathematics in most cases, and that's why attempts to defeat the algorithms often resort to brute force. But a key itself is nothing more than a phrase or a character string that becomes equivalent to some binary number. We take a key or phrase, let's say we pick a password like chalkboard, we turn that into a binary number, and that binary number is used by the computer as the input to an encryption algorithm. So there are 2 key types. Symmetric keys are the keys that most people know about, most people think they understand, and most people have seen in use, at least in the movies. Symmetric keys are keys which match between the sender and the receiver. In other words, there's really only one key. And both the sender and the receiver use that same key. They are computationally efficient. That is to say, when you do encryption with symmetric keys, they're extremely efficient. The computer doesn't have to do nearly as much work as it might do with other kinds of keys. But the problem is that they're difficult to manage, especially when you have large groups. I'll give you an illustration of why that's the case. But they are really nice for a single session. So most often, people who talk about symmetric keys are referring to them as session keys, keys used in a single session. On the other hand, the other type of key, asymmetric keys, which are theoretically almost inconceivably slick, and I'll try to point that out. Asymmetric keys, sometimes called public keys, are computationally inefficient. We can't do things like encryption of video with public keys because simply the computing necessary to do it is way beyond what the computer is able to stay up with in terms of the real time of the video that's being transmitted. But they are easy to distribute. So they're good for session setup. So immediately you can see if this type key can be used to do the setup of the session, and then we can switch to this type key over here to do the ongoing encryption, we might have a pretty workable system. So let's look at symmetric keys. I'll always refer to a symmetric key as a secret key. There is a lot of confusion in the industry about the two terms secret key and private key. When I refer to private key, I'll be talking about the partner to a public key, a private key, public key combination. I'll use the term secret key to refer to a symmetric key, one in which the sender and receiver are both using the same key. So what happens is that someone has a clear text message to send. A wants to send a clear text message to B. They take the key, insert it into the algorithm along with the text message, and out comes what we refer to as the ciphertext. The ciphertext is transmitted to the receiver. The receiver takes the ciphertext and the same key that was used over here, inputs those two things into the decryption algorithm, and out comes a clear message. So symmetric keys match between the sender and the receiver. In AV, the key might typically be permanently stored in the sending and receiving device. It might also be burned into the firmware at the factory or added manually after setup. Or it might be stored and retrieved from a thumb drive or a memory card that's inserted into the device. Think, for example, of a set-top box in which you put a card in and the key is on the card and retrieved from the card. So here's the problem with symmetric keys. If we have a large group, they're difficult to manage. If I have only one pair of people that are communicating, only A and B are communicating, I only need a single key. But then if the group increases to a third party and we add C, C now needs a key for A and a key for B. So we now need one key plus two more because C joined. If we move to a third person in the group, we now need all the keys we needed here, but D needs three more keys. One for B, one for A, one for C. So now we need 1 plus 2 plus 3 keys. We need 6 keys. 5 parties? It's not hard to figure out. We need 10 keys because we need 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 keys. That adds up to 10 keys. With 6 parties, we'll need 10 keys. So I think you can start to see the pattern that happens here. Each time you add a person, you add the number of keys that that new person needs. And so we end up with a sequence 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 until we reach the number of parties that are trying to communicate. So for example, with 50 parties trying to communicate so that everybody could communicate securely with everybody else in the party, we'd need 1,225 keys. Well, it isn't just that we need an awful lot of keys. The problem is, how do we get the keys to the parties? We have to somehow deliver them securely. And that's a difficulty with symmetric keys. So generally, we restrict the use of symmetric keys to a situation like this, where there are only 2 parties or 3 parties. We encrypt things for a single session, and then we regenerate new keys. So one of the things that we can do if we need to use symmetric keys is come up with a technique by which we can create keys on the fly. The process that's most widely used is called the Diffie-Hellman technique, named after the 2 people that developed it in the late 1960s or early 1970s. The process bears their names because, quite frankly, it's the only thing they got out of this. We're going to talk about another technique that the people were wise enough to patent and became billionaires. But Diffie and Hellman were college professors, didn't worry much about patents, and they put this out in the public domain. And as a result, they never became rich off of the idea, and yet it's a brilliant idea. I'll walk through this process for you carefully, but keep in mind that in any process like this, it's not secure unless there is some secret, someplace that nobody can get hold of. And that happens here. So Alice says to Bob that she wants to communicate. And Alice sends Bob two numbers and says, hey, I'd like to have a communication session. We need to generate a key. Now, while she picks these two numbers, she also picks a third number, which she keeps as her secret. Bob says, okay, I'll communicate. He acknowledges the two numbers that he received from her, and he selects a third secret number. This secret number here and this secret number here are completely different. They've picked them separately. So Alice has a secret, Bob has a secret, but they've exchanged these two numbers. Now, Alice next takes her three numbers and inserts them into a mathematical function called the Hellman function, and it creates a number called x. Bob takes his three numbers, the two he got from Alice, and his secret, puts it into the Hellman function. He generates a number called y. They trade these two numbers. Alice then takes her two original numbers, her secret number and y, puts that into the Hellman function, and she creates the key that they're going to use to communicate. Bob takes his two original numbers, his secret third number, and inserts an x, the number he received from Alice, puts it into the Hellman function. He generates the same key. They both have now the same symmetric key to do the encryption. The thing that's brilliant about this process is anybody who is observing the exchange between these two without the knowledge of x and y cannot generate this key. So the point is that this can happen on the fly. And what's important, really important about this process is to understand this happens millions and millions of times per hour all over the internet all the time. Diffie-Hellman key creation, it's called. Now, let's turn to the other type of key. Asymmetric keys, sometimes called public keys, involve a public and a private key for each party that's going to communicate. A has a public key, A has a private key. B has a public key, B has a private key. A and B make their public key widely available. They can post it on a website. They can announce it in a meeting. Your public key you make available to everyone, and everyone that uses a public key does make it widely available. So what happens here is that if A uses his public key to encrypt a message along with the clear text, they produce ciphertext. The trick here is that in order to decrypt a message, it takes the other key in that pair. So if the public key did the encryption, it's the private key that leads to the decryption back to the clear message. I can use A's public key and then the private key, or I can first encrypt it with the private key and then decrypt it with the public key. As long as one of the keys is used to do the encryption, the other key can be used to do the decryption. So how do we use this in communication? A has a message to send to B. A encrypts the message with B's public key. A uses his partner's public key. A uses B's public key to do the encryption. The output's a ciphertext. That's transmitted to the receiver. Now, anybody can observe this transmission, and in fact, we can see this in some of the packet traces that I have in the course. You can actually see the transmission of the ciphertext. But the trick is that nobody else has the proper private key except B to do the decryption. So B securely decrypts the message and finds out what A said to B. So A communicates to B by using B's key to do the encryption, B's public key to do the encryption. And that raises a question which I'm going to give you a minute to think about. How does B now securely respond to A? How does B communicate to A using public keys? And how does she do it, or he do it, in a secure method? Well, if you get the idea here, it's B is going to have a message to send to A, and she's going to use A's public key. That will encrypt the message into ciphertext. It'll be transmitted over to A. A has the proper private key, his own, to do the decryption, and he recovers it. So 4 keys are involved in the communication between A and B. Always you are encrypting with your partner's public key. How do we distribute the keys? That's really neat. We can distribute any way we want because the key that's going to be distributed is just the public key, and it's been made available to everyone anyways. There are several popular encryption algorithms that are used to do both symmetric and asymmetric encryption. The most widely used symmetric encryption in the world is Digital Encryption Standard, DES. It's been very, very widely used in the financial industry. It's used in some low-level military applications, but DES has been around probably for about 25 years, and it's extremely widely used. It is vulnerable to attack, but typically as long as it's used on encrypting something that doesn't have such high value that somebody can dedicate lots and lots and lots of computer processing in order to break, it's pretty secure. One that's similar to DES and used in wireless networks is RC4. There was an RC1, 2, 3, and so forth. RC4 is the one that's currently used. But the one that's most widely respected and secured today is called Advanced Encryption Standard. There are 128-bit key, 256-bit key, up to 1024-bit key versions of AES, and it's considered extremely secure. It takes huge amounts of computing time in order to break by brute force. On the asymmetric side, there are only two that are widely used. One is called RSA, which stands for Rivest, Shamir, and Alderman, the three mathematicians who came up with the technique. It's the most widely used. It's used in SSL, Secure Socket Layer transmissions, and elliptic curve, which is becoming more and more widely used, but still doesn't begin to have the acceptability that RSA has. Okay, let's turn to the idea of a hash. A hash of a message is a fixed length code that's produced by a mathematical algorithm when the input is clear text. I take a message, I put it into this algorithm. What comes out is a fixed length code. The most common two techniques that are used to create hashes are Message Digest 5, called MD5, and Secure Hashing Algorithm 1, or SHA-1. It's not encryption. The message is input into the hashing algorithm, and out comes something called a message hash. This is kind of a short representation of a longer message. You can go on the internet to this website that's on this page here, and you can see how this works. But to give the idea of what the purpose of this is, if I have a message I'm transmitting, Mary had a little lamb, and I run it through the MD5 hashing algorithm, I get this 32-byte, 32-character code. If somebody changes the word lamb to the word pig, when the receiver would do the computation, they would get a completely different code. So they would know that something had been changed in the message. Make a slight change in the message, and you get a completely different code. But the length of the code depends only on the process that was used. MD5 always produces a 32-character code. Secure Hashing Algorithm 1 would take the message Mary had a little lamb, and it would produce a 40-character code that looks like this. Mary had a little pig produces this code here. So one of the purposes here is to create, in a sense, something that looks like a shortened version of the message that the receiver can use in order to do computations to guarantee integrity, do some message signing and things like that. We'll see how hashes are used in just a minute. So when I want to sign a message, I take the clear text, put it through the hashing algorithm, get something that's called the message digest. That shortened version of the message is encrypted with either the secret key or the private key in the private-public key combination that I have. I send that to my receiver. My receiver looks at that digital signature, decrypts the digital signature with the corresponding public code, and they know that that hash, as long as that hash matches what they compute themselves, they know that it came from me because it obviously had been encrypted with the proper private key for the sender. So we say the message is signed by whoever owns this key. I could do this with a symmetric key also, as long as I knew that the symmetric key was owned by A. Either encrypt it with A's private key, encrypt it with A's secret key. Either way, it proves that the hash of the algorithm came from A. That's how we came up with the term digital signature. It serves really the same purpose that a signature serves on a real document. So let's turn to authentication. Authentication, again, is the process in which we make sure or validate the source that's sending the message. So I can do authentication with either key type. If I'm a server and I want to authenticate with the symmetric key, I'll just say to the client, hey, take your username and password and our shared symmetric key, encrypt that and send it to me. If you send me the correct encrypted ciphertext, I'll be able to decrypt it with the same key, and I'll know that it came from you because you own that key. Or I can say, here's a random number, which we often call a nonce. Here's a big random number, some big primary number, 36,531,326 or whatever. That obviously wouldn't be prime because it's even. But in any case, we send a large prime number. We encrypt it with our shared symmetric key, and you return the result, and I check it to make sure that really you are the owner of that key. With asymmetric encryption, I'll say as a server, take your username and password and encrypt it with your private key, that is with the client's private key, and send it to me. I'll be able to decrypt it with your public key, and I'll know it came from you. Or do the same thing with this large prime number, this nonce. Encrypt it with your private key, send it to me. I'll be able to decrypt it with your public key. So we can authenticate and encrypt with either symmetric or asymmetric keys. So we've achieved two of the results that we wanted. We have privacy and we have an authentication technique. But all of these keys, and particularly public keys, are subject to a problem, the bad guy that might be in the middle. Suppose someone can eavesdrop on our communication. For example, suppose somebody has a wireless connection, or suppose that we're using a wireless connection, and there's somebody in the room that has a packet sniffer. Can they compromise the security of the relationship between A and B? Absolutely they can. We're going to call this person Mallory because Mallory is always the name that they use in all the textbooks. So first, Mallory does a denial of service attack on A. In other words, he does something like send 3,000 packets per second to A that basically keep A busy processing. I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. Let me go back. Mallory will do a denial of service on B to keep B from sending any message to A temporarily. And then he will say to A, hey, I'm B, and here's my public key. Then he reverses the process, does a denial of service on the other end, and says, hey, B, I'm A, and here's my public key. Now, A and B think they have a secure relationship between each other because A thinks that they have the proper key from B, B thinks they have the proper public key from A. So they think they have a relationship between them that they can securely communicate. Mallory's next step is to do what's called an ARP redirect attack. And that causes traffic being sent from A to B, from A's IP address to B's IP address, to relay through Mallory. And at this point, Mallory has the appropriate public key to decrypt whatever A said. He has the proper private key, matching B, the one he sent B. He has the private key to re-encrypt to send to B. And essentially, he can sit in the middle and watch the communications go back and forth between A and B and decrypt and re-encrypt everything that goes both directions. It's called the man-in-the-middle attack, and unfortunately, it's fairly widely used. You've heard so much in the news about some of the big financial company compromises that took place. Some of those were done with man-in-the-middle attacks. So the question becomes, what do we do about this? What do we do about Mallory in the middle? Well, the whole process depends on the authenticity of the public keys. When Mallory said to A, I'm B, and here's my public key, he needed a way to check that. So what happens is that we introduce the idea of a certificate authority, a trusted third party called a certificate authority. The role of the certificate authority is to validate or authenticate public keys. So when A sends a message to that's reported to B, when A sends a key that's reported to belong to B, A sends a message to B's certificate authority and says, hey, is this really B's key? And of course, the certificate authority is going to say, no, it isn't. Likewise, B, when they want to check that the public key that they got from A is really A's public key, they'll check with their certificate authority and say, does this key really belong to A? And the certificate authority will say, no, it doesn't. The only way to compromise this system is to compromise the certificate authority, and for reasons that become apparent pretty quickly, the certificate authority is extremely difficult to compromise. The certificate authority is often a service provider for which you pay a small fee for each certificate, and I'll give you a list of them. I'll show you where you can see a whole list of them. But it's also true that the certificate authority can be an internal device such as a server. The assumption then is that it's highly unlikely that the man-in-the-middle attack can be mounted when we're on a secure internal network. Now at this point I want to digress just for a minute and talk about the protocol which uses certificate authorities that's more widely used than any other protocol, called SSL, Secure Socket Layer. Secure Socket Layer, SSL, is a security suite. That is, it's a combination, a collection of encryption, hashing, and authentication techniques that's used to collectively secure a connection. Going into detail about how it works is way beyond the scope of our study today. However, it's extremely widely used, and we'll mention it several times. SSL is probably the protocol that most often depends on certificate authorities. With AV devices, the certificate authority can typically, or can often be, one of the devices that's in the relationship. If you have a streaming server, for example, that streaming server could act as a certificate authority. Even between two devices, between two hardware devices, like an encoder and a decoder, one could act as a CA to the other. I just pulled this out of my Internet Explorer. You can get this corresponding screen out of your web browser. This shows some of the certificate authorities that my web browser stores. When I set up a connection, my SSL connection might say that we're using, for example, Microsoft Authentication Services, and you can see here that that's available. And the request to validate a public key could be sent to Microsoft's Authentication Service, or to GlobalSign, or to many, many other organizations. I forget it, but I think there were 75 or 100 different certificate authorities that were listed in this screen within Internet Explorer. In AV applications, encryption can be used by adaptive streaming servers, where they may use either symmetric encryption if the client and the server both can be reached and we can install the shared key. In surveillance and other cameras, they typically do use symmetric encryption. They typically do use a secret key. Audio very often uses a secret key. For authentication, streaming servers will often use public keys and use an authentication server. I'm going to mention something about WAUS and how they do that. Wi-Fi can use either symmetric or public key certification, authentication, and cameras typically do not use public keys. They typically use shared keys or secret keys. And what happens in these cases, for example, with a camera and a recorder, they'll use symmetric encryption because we can configure the shared key in the camera, then configure the shared key in the recording server, and then they can go ahead and use that key for encryption. The compromise here can only happen if somebody physically gets access to these devices. Within an encoder, a decoder, like a set-top box, they'll typically use symmetric key encryption because, again, the administrator of these devices can manually put the key in each device, and then they can use that key to do the decryption. But with adaptive streaming servers, they'll probably combine the two. They'll use public keys to establish identity and negotiate a key exchange. And once they have a secure relationship based on using public keys, they'll generate a symmetric key, a shared key with Diffie-Hellman. Then they'll encrypt the actual video and audio that's going to be transmitted using that shared key. They'll also regenerate the keys during the exchange. Here's a nice example. I sit on a TIA committee which has been studying Netflix behavior for about 1.5 years or 2 years because it's kind of typical of the so-called adaptive bitrate video technologies. And in any case, here you can see the gray packets that are listed by the sniffer here, those gray packets are packets that are related to the SSL protocol. In fact, you can see here it says TLS version 1. TLS and SSL are the same thing. So this is an encryption process here, which is taking place before the video is transferred. And then down here we actually get the data packets. Right down here you can see the beginning of the gets that are asking for. Here it says get the video SAL5, and it gives the range of bytes that it wants to see in the video, and then get another chunk of the video, and so forth. So this is the negotiation and authentication before the video starts. What they're probably doing up here is authenticating that it's a Roku device, and then the video transfer begins. Now I took that trace, I took that sniffer trace, and I did a filter on just the SSL packets that are in it. And you see something kind of interesting. You see the authentication up here, then you see something down here where it says client key exchange beginning, and a key is generated here in order to do encryption. And that happens at about 4 seconds into the session. Then going on down here to about 8 seconds into the session, right down here, you see the same thing again, the client key exchange. So here a 4-second interval of video was encrypted with one key, and if you go further down here, about every 10 seconds after that, a new key is generated. So typically the chunks of video being delivered by the video server, which are about 10 seconds long, are being encrypted with a different key each time. A new key is being created with the Diffie-Hellman process. Another nice example of encryption is the way Wowza does it with Adobe RTMP. Adobe makes available Adobe Protected Streaming, which in turn uses one of two processes. So one process is called RTMPE, in which the server and the playing device creates a key with Diffie-Hellman, and the other is RTMPS, which uses SSL and requires certificates. Now there might be a tendency here to say, well, I don't want to fool around with the certificate authority, I'm going to use RTMPE. Just look in the Wowza documentation, they'll tell you this is subject to the man-in-the-middle attack. So as long as you're sure that the server and the client are in a secure environment where the man-in-the-middle attack cannot be mounted, it's okay to go ahead and use RTMPE. But they generally recommend using this, even though it requires a certificate authority. You can create the certificate authority within your own environment. So how does Wi-Fi use encryption? Well, it actually uses both shared key and public key. The current encryption standard for Wi-Fi that's most widely used is called WPA. WPA PSK, or WPA pre-shared key, means they're using symmetric keys. So typically, for example, in a home router, your access point documentation tells you, here's the key that you need to put into your client device. You take the wireless software for your Wi-Fi card here, you put the key in that's already in this access point, and then they can communicate with shared keys. Even though WPA is considered highly secure and uses AES 128-bit or AES 256-bit, it is vulnerable. It is vulnerable. You can spend about $135, get on the internet, buy a device, plug it in the wall near a Wi-Fi network that's using WPA pre-shared key, come back in a day or a day and a half, and the key will probably be in the device because it simply does a brute force attack until it finally finds the key. This is not to be confused with WEP, which should never be used unless it has to be. That's the older version of wireless security. That was broken within months of when it was published. This is the current version, WPA2 with pre-shared keys. It's still vulnerable. A better method is to introduce an authentication server, essentially a device that's acting like a certificate authority. If you introduce a Radius server, then the communication between here and here is simply to establish who is it that's trying to connect to the network. The authentication is actually carried across this secure connection here. And WPA EAP, which is WPA Extensible Authentication Protocol, is much, much more secure. And when possible, that's what should be used in any Wi-Fi network. So let's move to some general security practices. Some of these you probably know. Some you may only need to be reminded. But one is, and people in the telecommunications industry and people in the AV industry are a little bit slack on this sometimes, I think, is make sure you have good physical security on your devices. The way you can get a pre-shared key into a device, or the way you can defeat the shared key that's in the device, is get access to the device. So lock it up, keep track of who accesses it, make sure that you have good physical security to keep people away from the devices. You can't always do that with PCs, but you certainly can with the other end of the communication with encoders and servers and things like that. Keep them away from those devices. Know your people, especially know people on the phone or people that are emailing to you. It is still the most widespread vulnerability on the planet Earth is people that give away the security secrets, give away the password, the account information, because they think they're talking to a legitimate person on the phone, or they think the email actually came from their boss. So make sure that you know the people that you're dealing with, especially when the communication is going to be over the phone or via email. And try to teach people that it's so critical to do that. 75 or 80% of the vulnerabilities happen because somebody gets fooled, some human being gets fooled. Passwords. Passwords for most AV devices that are default in the original factory are widely available. I can get the passwords to just about every wireless router. I can get the password to just about every camera that's manufactured. I can get that on the manufacturer's website. So use mixed characters and create a fairly complex password and come up with a crib system. Sometimes for my passwords, I use something that's around a house that I've been working with. Maybe I'm doing some woodwork, building a desk or doing something like that, and I'll come up with phrases about that work or phrases about that desk and use the first letter in each phrase and then change the O's to zeros, change the L's to 1. In order to come up with something, change the S's to $, come up with a password that involves characters, uppercase, lowercase, symbols, and numerical characters. That will improve the quality of the password system and dramatically increase the number of attempts that have to be made by software or devices trying to do a brute force attack. Finally, make sure you keep your software updated. The best friend you have is the manufacturer. They're going to know about the security flaws before almost anybody else does, and vast majority of manufacturers are good enough and honorable enough that whenever they know that there's a flaw in their software or a security hole in their software, they're going to go ahead and get it fixed right away if they can. So it's always important to keep software updated, keep the firmware in your devices, your encoders and players and things like that, keep that updated in order that those security holes and security flaws can be corrected. So what should you worry about? Well, for heaven's sakes, worry about your staff's awareness and the level and practices that they have relative to security. Have a good idea of what your staff knows and what they don't know and what kinds of things they're doing. Make sure they're not clicking on links that are in emails unless they know exactly who sent the email and what the link represents. By the way, those things are not that difficult to teach. How do you handle and discard data? You don't have to physically destroy a disk drive in order to get rid of data. There are simple routines you can use. One of the simplest things you can do say you have an old 20 gig disk drive and you want to get rid of it. You don't have to do anything real fancy with it. Take a 2 gig video and write it to the drive 10 times. You'll fill the disk with that video, and that destroys everything that was already there. So it's not that hard to get rid of data. There is a program called KillDisk, K-I-L-L-D-I-S-K, which is publicly available, open source program, does a nice job of writing all zeros and ones onto a disk. The way you'd really discard data is to write over top of it. And teach people about spam. I've mentioned this a couple of times because it's so important. People tend to accept spam messages way more often than they should. I have a Chase Bank card. I got an email about 2 weeks ago that looked so authentic I could not believe it. I called Chase and said, "Did you send this thing to me?" They said, "Well, take a look at the last 4 digits of the account number and you'll see that it probably has the wrong 4 digits on it." But I wonder how many people take the time to notice the subtle little thing like, well, the last 4 digits aren't exactly the same as the ones that I have on my card. And in fact, if they send 10,000 of those emails out, they're actually going to get lucky enough to hit the last 4 digits on somebody's card, and that person will think it's legitimate. So make sure that people understand that spam can be very, very real. What you should worry about includes disgruntled employees who left the company or their family members. I've been called into a couple of situations where the compromise that took place ultimately turned out to be the wife or the brother of a person who had been fired and not the person himself. And in fact, the employee was extremely upset when they found out that the other family member had gotten hold of their credentials to log into the system and had logged in and done the damage. And worry a little bit about security, somewhat about employees who claim to be security smart. As I mentioned, as we began this discussion, it turns out that security is an incredibly complex area, and it's an area that people can very often represent credentials that they really don't have. So be careful about people who say, hey, I know about that stuff. Make sure that they have appropriate credentials before they start to do security on your system. But you don't have to worry too much about encryption being broken. You don't have to worry much about the compromise of your certificate authority. You probably don't have to worry about data or items that have little value to the outside community. Even if they have value to you but don't have value to the outside community, they're probably not something you have to worry about. And you don't have to worry about people who have appropriate professional credentials from appropriate certified security firms. Neil, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. I've never felt safer. No, thanks to this module. And it's also very helpful on how to discard data. Very, very good. Hey, I have good news for everybody. There are CTS credits for attending this entire series from Professor Phil. And CTS credits now are dependent on viewing the entire series, again I say. So if you've missed one, you can review the recording at starin.biz/AV/IP/. I want to talk a bit about the upcoming workshops. If you'll see on the right in yellow are our AV Meetup coffee breaks, and they are 20 minutes in length, and it's an overview on the product at hand. And then on the left-hand side of your screen in white, we have our workshops. And May 15th, it's in this session we're going to discuss the MPEG transport mechanism. That's the most widely used format for carrying UP video. While it was popularized for IPTV, sometimes it's even hidden under streaming protocols used by the major vendors. From there, we're going to dig into multicasting and discuss practical concerns that seem to come up with deployments that use the MPEG transport stream. Specifically, we'll consider some AV products that depend on MPEG transport and multicasting. So don't forget workshops and AV Meetup coffee breaks. I want to ask again, just to get a quick poll for those of you that may have come in a little bit late, would you be interested in having an in-depth 3-day advanced live training session on AV over IP with Professor Phil live in person as your instructor? We're going to just get to gauge some interest levels from you and start the scheduling process. It's going to cost about $300 per attendee per day, and again, Professor Phil will be your instructor in person. So I don't want to take up any more time because I want to get to everybody's questions. How does use of secret key and hash prove message came from A? What if someone else had the secret key?
Well, that's actually relatively easy. It's not secret then. Obviously, if the key is compromised, the key needs to be destroyed.
Right.
So yeah, the authentication depends upon the key being what the term implies. It has to be secret. If somebody else has it, it's not secret.
Gotcha. And there's another question here that I can answer. Yes, there are CTS credits for attending, and it's for attending the entire series. So if you've missed one of the sessions live, you can always go back and view it at starin.biz/AV/IP/. Again, that's where you can view any previous recordings that you haven't seen it. What impact does the various encryption methods have on data transfer?
I think what they mean is a performance hit.
Right, yes.
I think that's what they mean. Yeah, and the answer is it's almost insignificant now. This seems almost inconceivable, but you can typically do 128-bit encryption in the time it takes to transmit a single bit, 1 bit. so that the encryption is no longer even a factor that anybody considers. If I have a 1,000 byte packet of data to send, that's 8,000 bits. I can encrypt it with symmetric encryption in 1 bit time. That is 1/8,000th of the time it takes to transmit it. So the transmission time is far more critical than the encryption time.
There's another question. AES 265 seems to be the standard. When will that increase?
That's a very common question, and I think the answer is probably it may never increase. It may be that the AES methods are defeated because of the power of processing before we actually reach the point at which we need 512-bit or 1024-bit encryption, because most research shows that doubling the size, doubling the length of the key does not make the task of finding the key or discovering the key that significantly more difficult. In other words, if I can crack it when it's a 256-bit key, it doesn't take that much more capability to defeat it if it's a 512-bit key. And we had a discussion the other day offline about this. Someone using AES 1024 is probably doing it for marketing purposes.
That's interesting. That looks to be about it. That looks to be about it for the questions. Again, thanks to everybody for joining us. You really make these successful, and we really appreciate it. And Professor Phil, as always, very informative. We're looking forward to the May 15th workshop. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on May 15th. Be sure and tell some of your colleagues about us. Take care, everybody. Have a great day. Have a great weekend, too, by the way.